Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Because it's time to write now.
Right.
All right, hey everyone. Kaufman's not going to be here right away, so he's having me do a writing sprint. Might have somebody come join me, may not. But regardless, afterwards, I will be talking about world building for fantasy, which I think is a good idea considering the Fated Fantasy contest, because I know some people, they need some help with that. All right, so everyone get ready to write now. Thank you for that, Megan. I didn't notice that was that. I thought that was on. But I hope everyone got some work done. I was just working on the expansion of the story that I did for the contest. It's a romance, and I'm actually having a lot of fun with it. It's not my usual genre, but it's fun. It's a lot more fun than I expected. Um, so I didn't know if I was going to be here by myself or not by the time the sprint ended, but I made sure that I had something to talk about while we're waiting for Kaufman to show up, or anyone else really. But so I posted a poll in the Discord, and I let people choose what they wanted to talk about tonight, and we ended up choosing world building for fantasy. I tried to pick topics that related maybe to to the Fated Fantasy contest. I know that right now the semifinalists are editing and doing all that and sending it in. But for those who want to continue their stories like I'm doing, or are editing their semifinalist stories, or whatever, this is always a good topic. Um, I do more world building than I do plot building, in all honesty. And I've had a lot of fun with it over the years. For people who don't know, I published a book last year, and I had the second book is coming out. Holy crap! In about a month, in a little less than a month, actually. But Pirates, I actually had to do some world building for that because it is a post-apocalyptic book. It is based off Earth, but much further into the future. So instead of like with something like The Last of Us or The Walking Dead, it's not like 20, 30 years. I went with about 2,000 years. World building for fantasy, and that's not a fantasy, but it does pertain to it. World building for fantasy doesn't just take like an existing world like Earth and turn it into something like a Harry Potter, for example. That's fantasy and that's set on Earth. But then there's other fantasies such as Avatar The Last Airbender, which is a good example, or James Cameron's Avatar, which is another great example, because one has to do with Earth and one is a completely different place. You could technically say the same about both, but in James Cameron's Avatar, we do see, especially if you watch the extended versions, we do get to see a little bit of Earth. It looks like New York or something, but maybe a little more technology. But for world building for fantasy, what I've always found helpful for myself is first think of, what is my story? What is the story I'm creating? And then I try to think of, okay, so now I know my story. What exactly do I want? Where exactly do I want to go with it? Do I want to take it and do I want to turn it into a mystery? Do I want to turn it into a romance? Do I want to turn it into a thriller, a horror, an action, whatever? Once you have your story down and you have the general idea of what you're going to do with it, where you're going to go with it, then start thinking, do I want it to interact with the world and how much, or do I want the world to be created and change my story to match the world? People I've noticed go back and forth. I think more people, at least from my own experience, design the world first and then design the story based off the world, and then details are filled later in that the story provides that actually match the world. But so like one example would be, there's a story that I haven't actually started working on yet, although I have the idea for it, about a creature, a race, a species that I created, an apex species called Ecali. They actually started out as a furry hybrid that I drew years ago, and then I ended up turning into its own species, and I plan on turning it into its own novel eventually. The creatures themselves were the first thing created, and then I designed the world around them long before I decided on any kind of storyline. The creatures themselves were, think of like a draconoid almost, but with fur and large wings that are more like a bat's. And I designed their entire physiology, I designed their culture, I designed their behavior, everything. And then I decided, what's my world going to be? They were very they're very large, but they're like birds in a way where they have hollow bones and large lungs. So I had to design their world to accommodate that. Where could a creature like that live? They ended up living among the cloud above the clouds. They live on I believe it's Venezuela where these cliffs are located that go above the clouds. It was loosely based off of that. It might be a different location, but that's the same general kind of area I was thinking of. So I designed their world to match them rather than match them to the world, because they had already been created and it was much easier to just create the world to match them rather than just maybe potentially start from scratch or change various things that would not have worked very well otherwise. Their culture was created around them after the world was created. Their world is more or less like Earth. It's technically a different planet, but I would consider it fantasy versus sci-fi, because there's not a whole lot of technology, because it does revolve around Sakal, the main character, and their culture is a mixture of Native American and Aborigine almost. There might be a few other things in there, but I haven't fleshed it out nearly as much as what I've been doing for my romance. Um, but their culture was developed based on their behaviors. So, for example, for them, I had to think, okay, so they don't have a magic system, but their culture could be considered fantasy because we don't live that way. I know that could also be a sci-fi thing, but I took it more as fantasy. I had to think of what's going to match them and go from there. But I know this goes along with the world building. Another thing that I let people choose is making magic systems. That actually does really go into the world building, because sometimes a magic system is based off the world, and or the world is based off that. So I'm going to include that a little bit here. But the magic system, you have to think of, how does the world affect that? Does the magic system require like certain kinds of plants? Does it require a certain amount of water? Does it need a certain amount of earth? Are there certain kind of terrains that affect the magic? So you have to think of, when world building, and I'm talking more of in a geography sense in this case, of what does it act like? What does it look like and what does it act like? I tend to take things more scientifically rather than just simply fantastical. So I'm always thinking of in terms of like tectonic plates, geological activities such as the plates shifting, volcanoes forming, etc. But that can still go into fantasy world building. And I think of, okay, so if there's a magic system, would something like the Fae folk have an effect on that? Could like magic they use, or could magic unicorns use, or dragons use, or anything like that affect the world? And therefore, how would the world affect that? And if you guys have any questions or want me to like to touch on something specific, please let me know, because I'm just sitting here talking myself over the live. So, and without questions, I know I'm going to tend to ramble a little bit, and I apologize for that. Um, so we think something else for world building and fantasy. Oh, here's a question I've actually seen posed, not in the Right Now community, but elsewhere. The fantasy versus sci-fi. Can you do fantasy world building with sci-fi elements like technology? Yes, but there's it's to a certain point. Once you get to a certain point, it is no longer considered fantasy and considered sci-fi. I think it has to be. Okay, yeah, no, that's good. Thanks, Lynn. So, let's see, go to the comments here. So, discreetly and naturally set the rules for the world in the prose. Without looking up how to word things specifically, my first thought is not just stating things. It's kind of ties into like the show versus tell. Let me think if I can think of a good example. Wow, I actually cannot think of a good example off the top of my head. I tend to read a little more historical fiction or sci-fi than fantasy, so I may not have. I probably can think of something if you give me enough time, but discreetly and naturally set the rules of the world in prose. Um, yeah, I can only think of doing like the show versus tell instead of just stating that magic does this, magic does that. That animals affect this, animals affect that. Certain races appearing, certain species appearing. It's things that you world building tips for pantsers like me. Give me 1 second unwritten and I will go into that. But I'd say discreetly and naturally set the rules for the world in the prose. That yeah, again, sorry for repeating myself. That's a more I still keep thinking show versus tell. You talk about how there's elves, you talk about how there's dwarves, and yes, you might say, oh, dwarves are miners. Dwarves go for, gems and gold and everything found in the earth. Instead of just simply stating that, um, actually, a good example from that, I'm thinking from The Hobbit. If you watch The Hobbit, because I've read it too, but I've watched it more recently, so I'm going to compare it more to the movie than the actual book right now. Um, but we got to see Moria in The Lord of the Rings, and we got to see the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit. We had these great big forges. We saw at the beginning of the movie, and granted, this was more of a more like I think of a dialogue, and it was kind of a telling, but it had an amazing amount of showing. We got to see the dwarves hanging alongside the walls as they mined. So we weren't just told that's what they were doing, we actually got to see it. And to me, that's they discreetly and naturally setting the rules for that. I might be a little off, and somebody correct me if I am, please. But that's what comes to mind with that. World building tips for pantsers like me. Yeah, no, I am totally a pantser. I've kind of turned more into a plantser lately. Someone who does a little bit of both outlining and then just going by the seat of my pants. Um, I will say all of my world building for this was completely pants. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I did not write anything down for 18 years. Yeah, about 17 years, 17 to 18. Because it wasn't until a couple years ago that my husband shamed me into finishing this. But until then, I hadn't written down everything. I just kept everything up here. Um, and this can go for sci-fi. This can go for fantasy. This can go for literally anything. But what I did is I simply thought of what do I want my characters to be, and how do I want them to react. And so I ended up. I was like, okay, so I know this world is going to be mostly water. I'd say their world is about 90% water compared to ours. Um, but that wasn't established until I actually wrote it. The actual powers, the genetic abilities from the characters were not established. We're not actually concrete until I established them in the writing. I could have changed them at any point before that. I gave hints very early on in the first part to what Kasai's powers are. But and I know this is where a lot of people think my book is fantasy, but his powers they're he's what's considered a heat genetic or a flame genetic depending on how you want to look at it. But I could have gone any way with him. I did not have it written down exactly what he could do until it was written in this. Once it was written in the book, that's when it was established. Before that, I just simply went with what felt right. As I was planning it over the years, I knew that Kasai was going to have flame-based abilities. I knew that he was going to radiate extra heat. And I knew that he could control it. Not that he could turn into it, but that he can control it. And I kept it in my head, and it wasn't concrete until I wrote it down. And then it's like, oh, holy crap, he's not like Ace or Sabo from One Piece. he's more like a firebender from The Last Airbender. And I've seen other pantsers do similar things. They don't concretely establish things. They don't I want to say this. Thank you, Natalie. um but but I've seen a lot of other pantsers do this. They think about what they want to do. They know what they want to do, or at the very least, they have a very good idea of what they want to do. And like me, they don't write it down. They don't put it in stone until it hits the book. And then suddenly it's written and it's like, oh, this actually makes sense. This actually works. That goes for fantasy, that goes for sci-fi, that goes for like literally anything. And a lot of my world building was like that. All right. And hi Kaufman.
Hello, hello, hello. Greetings, friend. How's the writers group been going tonight?
I think it's actually been going pretty well. I've been talking about the world building for fantasy, and it kind of turned into in the let's see, it was Unwritten who asked world building tips for pantsers, and I was just talking about that and what's helped myself and what I've seen others do, and so I think it's kind of been working.
Well, that's kind of cool, actually. I mean, we as fantasy writers, we love our world building.
World building is so fun.
Oh man, how did the sprinting go? How was the
We did
writing
a
sprint?
45-minute sprint, and I doubled what I had been doing in the last 3 hours, so I am
Mm-hmm.
very good myself.
Did you have anybody join you today, or have you been kind of running the?
It has been just me.
You know what? So gold star for holding it down.
Uh, yeah, I'm gonna have to get used to that if I do that anymore. But it's been fun. It's been fun.
Well, I'm sure you were amazing, my friend. I appreciate you holding it down. My
Oh
schedule
yeah,
sucks this month.
it's just been fun.
Oh man, I could like literally never miss one, but like, my schedule is literally all over the place. I'm like, hopefully June it calms down, and then July I'll be able to normalize, take a vacation.
That would be nice. You need to relax, dude.
I know it's kind of funny. My version of a vacation, my family jokes around about it. So like your version of a vacation is you stream for 2 hours, you hop on emails and messaging for an hour to two, and then you take a vacation the rest of the day. And I'm
Why do
like,
I feel like that
"Huh?"
would be accurate?
Yeah. And I'm like, well, you know what? That is called the vacation of someone trying to build a business for the first 5 to 10 years.
Hmm? I just saw a really good comment from Mary. Try to expand world building as my characters move through it. Trick is not to info dump too many world elements at once. Yes, on that last bit especially. I have done that, and it is difficult not to do,
Mhm.
especially when you're writing fantasy and you have
Mhm.
like 10,000 things you want to tell people.
Oh no. As many trick as to not info dump too many world elements at once. Yeah, I mean, I think back in the day, right? Back when in the days of Token and Lord of the Rings, this was what I think 70s, 80s, 90s when at least especially in fantasy you could get away with a lot of world building, a lot of info dumping
Oh, yeah.
because there was a greater interest in setting up worlds and scenes and locations and all those things. But in the digital age of ebooks, self publishing, and limited time and fractured attention spans, people just don't have the attention spans for that.
Yeah.
And I think also with right media and streaming and all the things, I think stories have to really engage people. And when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to world building, there's a lot of world building elements that we need to do. But if you're talking about a tree for so long, it's you're going to lose the reader.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not gonna lie. For anyone who knows the Earth Children series by Jean M. Oel, I
Mhm.
love that series. I reread her stuff just because it helps me with my own
Mhm.
description, my own description imagery. But I have skipped pages after pages after pages after pages because my God, you described this in the last book for like half a chapter. We know what it looks like. It's not bad. It's really good and it's very descriptive.
Mhm.
I think the worst person, the person in the world who has the worst mind for actually seeing an image in their head, could get
Mhm.
a good image in their head based off what she describes. She's that
Mm.
good. But yeah, it's overkill. It's like way overkill.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm kind of like I feel like I'm faced with a really interesting world building challenge in Scarecrow, at least in terms of like the nature part of the world itself. Now, to be clear, at least for fantasy, right? There's a lot of different elements that could be considered world building. Generally, magic systems can be considered a part of world building. Cultures, societal rules, the
I actually mentioned culture and magic systems.
mhm. I and what's interesting and something that I've really thought through is because Scarecrow deals with a lot of environmental, and environmental has drastically not only shaped the world, but it is very ingrained into the character's journey. So I'm always trying to ask myself, what's the balance between describing the state of the world that's going on around them because it's so unnatural. Now I know people don't want to hear about the mountain, but if the mountain is suddenly covered in lava and the mountain is moving, they might want to know about it, but I know they don't want to
Yes.
hear about a mountain. So I'm trying to figure. I'm always trying to find what's that right balance because the world state is so unnatural. Um,
That's a good
mhm.
challenge.
hmm And that's something I just kind of like recognize throughout the whole story, right? But it's the world, and it's nothing that like that unless they're dealing with like a severe weather condition, right? Like I have the characters going through a desert at one point, and then they start dealing with like tornadoes, but it's tornadoes that are rising from the ground. So it's almost like
Dust
yeah, it's like
devils.
it's like sand. It's like sand tornadoes in a sense, and then they're accompanied by lightning. So it's interesting. It's as if you were caught in a lightning thunderstorm, but it was wind and lightning, and it came from the ground instead of from the sky.
Hmm.
hmm So it's like clearly, if you're trying to get through that, you're struggling with a little bit of the elements.
In that case,
hmm
though, that kind of makes me think of the Expanse from Pirates.
hmm
It's a massive stretch of ocean with like nothing.
hmm
There's like a few little islands that have nothing growing on them,
hmm
so there's not really anything that happens. It's
Interesting.
those kinds of terrains in general are very
hmm
hard to make interesting,
hmm
but at the same time are very easy to kind of overdo almost, I think.
Yeah, and it will be interesting. Like I know inherently I tend to over describe, but I have a lot of settings and scenarios throughout Scarecrow where there it's a man ver it's I mean I'm calling because the term is man versus nature, but
Yeah.
what I should say is it's character versus nature, and that's really what that type of obstacle tends to be. Um and it's interesting because a lot of it's one of the classic stories. A portion of Scarecrow is very much a character versus nature because the and there of course there's the antagonist, but so much of their journey is shaped and directed and creates obstacles as a result of the world state. And it's always interesting, but I have to find that balance because I can't like you said, I can't talk about the sand dunes for too long or the reader gets bored.
Yep. Like Mary
Mhm.
said, the reader just may not finish it.
Yeah, I got
Or they
too
may
much
do like
info
what I
for
did
'em.
and just skip like chapters at a time.
Yeah, and Mary, you bring up a really good point. I think there's also trying to find that balance of how much information do I give the reader, and then there's a sentence structure level. There's absolutely a sentence structure level that a lot of writers, not Mary, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying a lot of writers in general can sometimes take for granted. If I have a large paragraph, and let's say maybe it's an action scene and I have the character doing some type of fight and then a magic thing happens and then they get hurt. If I include all of these things in this really long paragraph, the reader is more likely to miss part of the information because the way that we read paragraphs is we start at the beginning and we go through. Beginning is almost like the hook for a paragraph, and then the meat, and then the ending. And the end tends to be a transition to the next paragraph. So if we info dump in a paragraph, some of the information gets lost. But if those things are broken up by dialogue, they're broken up by action, by separate paragraphs, the reader's attention will not be lost. And it's
Even
just
if it's
something.
all just description, breaking it up still helps.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
actually doing that right now in Bound by Song. It's because I'm actually doing a lot of world building right now, actually.
Mhm.
I've designed an entire culture, and I will admit I went completely overboard and designed a language. I actually designed technically 2 languages, but I'm
Language
not
is
going
fun.
as deep into one of them.
Language is
Um,
fun.
it is a lot of fun,
Mhm.
and I am having, like, way too much fun actually writing it. But basically what I'm writing right now is a culture, and
Mhm.
part of their culture is simply how they dress, and
Mhm.
some of it is also how they act. And I
Mhm.
just introduced a kind of antagonist sort of for the main character,
Mhm.
and he is everything the main character is not, and you can tell it by the way he dresses
Mhm.
alone. And his dress is very he's like a royal knight, basically. He's like a
Mm.
royal knight in training almost. How he dresses is he's not wearing armor, but it might as well be. It's like very finely plated chainmail. He looks the part. I
That's really cool.
described that very well, and I broke it into 2 paragraphs
Mhm.
because I felt like because it wasn't like it was like a super long paragraph, but
Mhm.
I felt like after I described the way it looked and then the way he moved, it needed to be separate or else people were going to lose one of those 2 things. And then I have it broken, and then as you get further down, which is where I'm at right now, we get
Mhm.
to the actual spicy part, not like sexy parts,
Mhm.
but just very fun part of the chapter where the main character is just like, "Holy crap, please, for the love of God, let me go." Um, we get to see more of the culture and more of the shock,
Mhm.
where you can see the massive disconnect of this is well thought out, this is designed, and if I took everything and made it into 2 paragraphs, even 3, there'd be too much. But I
Mhm.
broke it apart, partially by description, partially by action, to let people breathe between the paragraphs so that they know what's happening and they can think, oh, wait a minute, let me read this paragraph again, and they're not going to lose it. But I try
Yeah.
to keep like
Mhm.
descriptions together, and I try to keep dialogue and action together, and try not to mix it too much because that alone can be considered a kind of info dump and can be
Mhm.
very overwhelming.
Yeah, I could completely agree with that. And I think even touching upon Lynn point, Lynn, you're like, we also do a lot of reading on phones and Kindles, and long
Yes.
paragraphs lead to eye fatigue, right? And there's a
Yeah.
reason that ebooks are taking up so much of the market. And I think a question that I always like to pose to writers is ask yourself this. If you're like unsure, or maybe you're so used to reading, you're writing over and over again, the question you want to ask yourself is what does the experience look like for a reader? And sometimes I'll make it into like a chapter. What is the chapter experience for a reader? Um, is that do you want for this, let's say, a specific chapter, right? Maybe it's like an action sequence. Do you want the action, the experience for the reader to be um, in the moment? Do you want them to not be asking questions? Do you want them to do you want it to be really short paragraphs? Do you want them to not really learn a lot, but want them to be more engaged and be like, oh, this is super cool, right? So
Yeah,
then you would
no, that
wait
makes
to
sense.
actions. You would do less interiority because interiority pulls the reader not necessarily out, but it's more introspection. Uh,
Yeah, that kind of
like
thing you
you
have
might
to.
do wittier dialogue. You might You might have some like cool like action things happen. Maybe some event happens. And then you're creating that experience, right? Because this chapter is an action chapter, and you're wanting to create that that kind of flow and pacing.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
actually had a chapter that was kind of a mixture of action and introspection. The
Mhm.
first half was the main character was kind of lost in his own head, remembering something that another character had said to him that got to him really bad.
Mhm.
And then suddenly it's still kind of an introspection, but it's more of
Mhm.
description of the outfits, description of what's about to happen,
Mhm.
and it's not enough action to like be like a complete 180. It's not like introspection to a fight because for the first time there was actually no fight in this entire book. It's something I actually
What?
wrote.
You
Yeah,
you
no, I'm
wrote
really
a
going
you
into the
wrote a
whole
book with
romance
no
thing.
fight scene? You
Yeah, there's
wrote a
no
book.
fight scenes. Well, I
What
mean,
the
there might
heck?
be like a verbal fight at some point, like somebody screaming at each other, but no physical fights, no swords, no guns, nothing.
How did you get through an entire book with no fight scenes, Soul? You're really challenging yourself.
Yeah, I honestly I blame this contest. I really blame this contest. The story I'm working on
Is this a
now,
fact that you're expanding upon?
yes,
That's
I'm
awesome.
actually really enjoying it a lot
Mhm.
more than I expected.
Mhm.
When I read the short story, the original short story for my other writing group, they loved it.
Mhm.
They wanted more of these characters, and I'm like, okay, you know what? They've heard my other stuff,
Mhm.
and they actually really liked that I did not have fighting for once. Okay,
That's
well,
actually
I
really
can go moments where I don't
interesting.
fight all the time.
Mhm.
It's not something I do often, but because I try to do a mix. But
Mhm.
they like this so much, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and try to do this and see what they think. They want me to continue this. I have,
Awesome.
I think I'm on chapter 11 right now,
Mhm.
and they're really liking it, and I love that. And there's no fight scenes. It's more of a I'm trying to say things without giving away because I know because I'm going to openly admit I got into the semifinalists. But if I say too much about my story, people are going to recognize it immediately, and I'm trying
Mhm.
to wait until
Until
either I continue on or I don't before I
Mhm.
say anything about what it is.
Mhm.
But basically, it's more of a emotional piece.
Mhm.
There's no physical action outside of like the main character like going like following this other character or wearing this style of outfit, or right now
Mhm.
it's in a court spring dance for royals where he's just like a massive ball of anxiety.
Oh,
But
yeah.
there's no fight, there's no guns, there's no weapons, and they've honestly said my emotional stuff is better, and I'm
That's
trying
actually
to
really
play
so
into
cool.
that, and it's working, and it's
So
really actually making me do world building that I half anticipated. I didn't expect to go full on create a language, but
Mhm.
it's a lot of fun.
Well, it definitely sounds like you're doing some really cool things with expanding that story. And I think something I'd love to touch on for a second, Soul,
Yeah,
is the revision aspect. So I know, and by the way, for anyone who's hopping into the stream or if you're watching on the replay, we are in the week before the Faded Fantasy competition. I know we have many of you in the chat, many of you watching who are either made it a semifinalist or have been involved in some part. I would love to hear how's the revisions going, or how was the storytelling process in general. I think it's always interesting writing a piece of flash fiction and then either thinking like, okay, I'm going to expand upon it, or I have to make changes to it.
I got to admit, my biggest challenge for this so far is actually, especially when I started doing the revisions. I've already sent those in, by the way.
Hmm.
I finished it yesterday and then sent it in like right away.
Hmm.
Um, because I'm expanding it, I had to make sure the short story did not match the novel. I kept out details. I
Hmm.
changed them.
Hmm.
In the novel, the details that are different actually work better in a longer story. In the
Hmm.
short story, they make more sense there.
Hmm.
But I had to make sure that like certain details didn't bleed into it. Not because I don't want them to be the same, because it's like a parallel universe sort of thing. It's like this event happened and this person was there instead of the other person kind of thing.
Hmm.
kind of like, different choices or whatever. So it's technically the same story, but told a different way. But I
Interesting.
tried to make sure that specific details really didn't bleed through into the revisions that I don't want there, that
Mhm.
only belong into the expanded novel.
Which is interesting. So I think that something that comes to mind is how do we as writers deal with revisions? Because we all have to go through a revision mode on every single one of our stories. Doesn't matter whether you are a discovery writer or an architect or what your writing style is, you're going to have to revise your original rough draft at some point, whether
Yeah.
it's flash fiction or an epic novel of a trillion words like Scarecrow's become. Um, and we got to go through the revision process. And I'm curious if you have a strategy behind revisions and what revision means. To me, a revision is you have a draft of your novel and you have to go through the story again and fix elements to get it to a more readable draft.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
I
know
think.
with my own revisions, I
Mhm.
went through the feedback that I was given, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but one thing they wanted was they wanted more interaction between the main character and one of the other characters. They wanted to see more of a romance,
Mhm.
because that's what I made, is I made a romance, and apparently they didn't see that, which I reread it and I realized, no, they were right. You
Mhm.
couldn't see the romance very well. So I went through, and what I did is I actually broke up my piece. Whew, I broke up my piece into four sections.
Mhm.
I had the first section, which was uh, the main character and character A,
Mhm.
and then I had the second section where it's main character and character A alone rather than in a crowd. The main character alone, and then the main character with character B.
Okay.
That's how I broke it up. And I took a look at each part and I'm like, okay, so character A appears in parts 2 and 4, or 1 and 4.
Mhm.
So where can I add in? Where can I change? This looks more like a romance. And I
Mhm.
reread it and I reread it and I almost made myself sick rereading it. And I'm like, okay, you know what? This line can be changed. This line can be expanded. This wording can
Mhm.
be changed a little. And I'm going to admit right now, I know eventually this is going to give me away.
Mhm.
I used my creative language in my revision.
Okay.
Originally, I had 3 words that I created for my short story that were
Mhm.
completely different, that were
Interesting.
2 different languages.
Mhm.
This time, I actually use an entire phrase, and
Mhm.
I did actually add a translation into what I submitted, so people can actually see what it means. And when
Mhm.
they actually see what the phrase means, it adds a lot more romantic tension between the main character and character B. And
Mhm.
then for character A, I added in more of it's clearly a one-sided thing, or it's clearly the main character's not going to be with character A.
Mhm.
And it was really interesting trying to figure out how to adjust that to the feedback I was given, because I hadn't realized how little they had seen of that until I read that, and it's like, oh, they have a point.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, and once again, this is to all writers everywhere. This is why feedback is so important, right? Regardless of the quality or regardless of the type, right? Whether somebody is going just for like friends reading it because they're trying to keep costs down, or whether you're going for alpha or beta readers, or whether you're going on for full editors, right? Regardless, like you got to get some type of feedback because we are almost blinded to the fault in the story. Now, of course, skill level helps us determine um, writing skill level can help us see some of those faults more often than not. But even like the best, strongest writers in the industry, they're still always going to have gaps. That's why they have big teams of people to see all the mistakes. Um, So it's always such a process to be able to see what others' feedback is and then be like, oh, yeah, those are the problems in this story that I didn't even know that was a problem.
Yep.
And maybe it could be something small, maybe it could be something big,
Yep.
depending on how the story was developed. I know, so I experienced that a little bit. I know after Freaky Friday, I wrote a flash fiction story, the Trollocs Ghost, and I know you were one of the ones that I got feedback from. And I asked for a couple people for feedback. And I think when I'd written it, I was like, yeah, I was so sure. I was like, it all made sense. I was like, yeah, it was great. But then I remember there's a couple of you guys who read it and like some of the minor like subtextual things I was trying to do was just completely lost. I was like, okay, but to me it was obvious. I'm like, I've been working
Yeah.
with it, but then I'm like, okay, well, if the reader misses those things, will they still walk away at the end of the story with the theme and the journey that I wanted to take? Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah, that's it's interesting how much you really miss when you write it yourself because you can see it in your head. And I think
Mhm.
honestly, a lot of authors forget only they can see that that not every reader is going to.
Mhm.
Because one of my bits of feedback was simply the ending of my story.
Mhm.
It it was kind of clear, but it could have been clearer. And then I
Mhm.
read it again, and it's like, oh, yeah, no, I could have made that a little better
Mhm.
because I didn't realize that I could see it. I knew obviously what he was going to do,
Mhm.
but they could only guess, and it was a weak enough guess. They had to say something.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I just find the revising process so interesting. And I think every writer has a bit of a different process when it comes to how they go about revising. I think that's different for every writer,
Yeah.
but I think that the fact that it needs to happen, I think everyone can agree on.
If they
Absolutely.
don't agree on it, then they're lying to themselves.
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think about what if it's really revisions that end up holding writers back a lot, or if it's maybe it's the time factor in it that holds back a lot of writers. And I have a manuscript, I have all this work that needs to be done, and now it's almost like maybe too much work to fix all the problems. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's going to vary from writer to writer, but what
Hmm.
I know I see a lot is people they write a first draft, they might even get it through a second draft,
Hmm.
but then it's like, oh my god, I have to go through this again, and it's almost tedious.
Hmm.
And I know for myself, oh my god, I cannot stand tedium. Do not ever make me do tedious work because I will bulk at it. I'm honest, I will bulk at that.
You think it's because it minimizes that the creative part of it to a lot of writers? We're like, okay, well, I'm not coming up with ideas anymore. I'm fixing problems.
I think sometimes
Mhm.
it's they're not coming up with ideas. I think sometimes it's, oh my god, can I please just work on something else for once?
Almost like
And I
needing
think
like,
some of
like
it's
a
also
teacher.
just I
Mhm.
already fixed this. Why do I have to do this again?
Because stories have many, many moving pieces. And the unfortunate truth is, at least especially from a developmental perspective, is if you shift one character's action, it's almost like a butterfly effect, right?
Yeah.
Depending on how ingrained things are in the story, changing one character's thing could then change another thing that's referenced in 20 pages, that changes another thing that's referenced in 40 pages, that changes another thing that affects the climax. And then if the reader goes through it and they catch it, they're going to be pulled out of the story.
Yep, I have
So
done that.
as the writer, we have to be aware of all of the different elements that could potentially pull a reader out of the story.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
actually did that with pirates.
Mhm.
There was a section in part one that
Mhm.
I had completely spaced on.
Oh,
And
really?
I didn't notice it until I was rereading and re-editing
Oh,
in part
no.
three. And
Oh,
it's like,
no.
oh crap, this character's not supposed to be.
Oh, no.
And then I did that in book two as well. One of the
Mhm.
characters completely disappeared. I completely forgot her, and I'm like, oh my god, it's gonna work out. She's coming back in the third book, and I have a reason why, but still,
So when you'll sounds like you'll be releasing Soul's Master Cut edition.
no.
What's that?
But
The Soul Cut.
uh, I'm not releasing that kind of edition.
Oh
It'd be
man.
funny, but no.
Mhm.
But I know, like with the revisions and like keeping to redo them, I know I had a hard time in the final edit of Pirates going through and
Mhm.
redoing that in the
Okay.
second book because that's the one I've had the most trouble with. I was
Oh.
reading through and I was going through part 2, and that's the middle of part 2, the big climax of the entire book aside from the end was the only part I had not figured out from any of the books before that point. I
Mm.
even had the third book done and
How
planned
many
out before I had the
books are
middle
in your
set.
series again, Soul?
So what?
How many books are in your series, or how many do you have planned?
There are three. There are technically 3 books in the trilogy, and then there's 2 novellas that come with them.
Okay, so 3 books. And is book 3, is that going to be the end of the series, or like how many?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a trilogy.
Yes.
And was it always going to be a trilogy?
Nope. It was supposed to be a single book.
Because it was a single book expanded into a trilogy because the story was just too long for one book.
There were too many characters I wanted to use,
Mm-hmm.
and there were too many ideas that it's like I think I can use them, and I try to figure out. And see that's where like the in my head editing and revision came into play
Mm-hmm.
because I knew what I was going to do originally. I had the ending planned out from the very beginning. Pirates started out as a comic.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be a
Really?
comic,
Really?
but the ending was always the same.
Oh no.
Kasai ends up finding his father, and it turns out really badly.
Oh god.
That never changed at all. But over
Mm-hmm.
the years, I kept revising it and changing it. And then when Mason shamed me into finishing it and to actually continue writing it, it's like, wait a minute. I
And
have certain
he was just like,
characters.
shame.
Pretty much.
Shame.
He just walked over and
Shame.
he's like, you've been working on this for so long. Why
Mm-hmm.
don't you do something with it? And just the way he said it's like,
Like,
it made me feel so bad.
I'm still imagining him like walking around with like the bell. Shame.
I'm
And then
pretty sure he would have done that
up like a
if he
book.
could.
Shame.
Oh, I can imagine him doing that. But when I finally started doing like the final version of it, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
wait a minute, I have these 3 characters that one of them was not in the book at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I really did not want to get rid of him.
Okay.
2 other characters I wanted to bring back. And it's like, no matter how much I revise Burning Ember, bringing them back would change the entire story. So I know there's got to be more than one book by that point.
Mm-hmm.
But the second book didn't feel right to bring either of those 2 back.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up actually bringing them back a little unexpectedly, but it worked out. It had a reason behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, okay, so I have this other character I haven't even touched yet, and I really don't want to get rid of him because he's too good of a character. I hate him, but he's too good of a character. He's a sadistic asshole, and he's one of those characters you want to slap that kind of person upside the head, but they are a perfect antagonist. And I could not get rid of him. It just felt so wrong to get rid of him. So that's how the second book came to be. In the third book, it's like, you know what? I can use these last 2 characters I haven't even touched yet, really.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put them in the third book, and now the third book, the end of part 1 is planned, the middle of part 2 is planned, and the end of part 3 is planned.
Nice. That's
Still
awesome.
working out minor details, but I'm so caught up and bound by song that it's like, I need to work on Pirates, but I also need to work on this.
Yeah, I'm not I don't know how many books Scarecrow is going to be. I call it Scarecrow, but the series is really Dawn of Magic series. I don't know. Like I kind of go back and forth because I already know the overall story. And Scarecrow's pretty set in stone by this point. I'm almost to the halfway mark. And I think all the major plot is I feel really strong about. And I think the biggest things I'm gonna have to fix is I'm kind of more on a character development and adjusting characters and wordiness and cutting down words.
Well, I'll say this: you kind of sound like I did with Pirates. I
Mhm.
thought everything was set in stone. I thought the characters were good, and then it turned into a trilogy.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Like, I always knew that it was going to be more than one book, and I realized that. I think around the time I was at this point, by the time I was around the halfway point of the first of the rough draft originally, like I knew it was going to be one book or more than one book, but I didn't know how many books, and that's kind of where I'm not sure yet. I know the plot, and I know the character journeys for the main characters for book two. And I know the overarching A story for the series. I know the story that I want to tell, and the story that's going to unfold over a series of books. What I don't know is if I can tell this overarching story in 3 books or not. Maybe yes, maybe no. And I feel like it's something I kind of have to continue to go through a discovery because I know there's so many parts of this world that I'm exploring that it's still yeah, I'm just not sure. I could see it potentially being a trilogy, or it could be something that's like 7, 8, 9 books. The truth is, I won't know because it's such it's a very expansive just a very expansive world,
Yeah,
and I
that's
think
kind of how it was with Pirates.
mhm,
I didn't know how many books I was really going to have until I decided I can't get rid of this one character and these other two need to be used. And then it's
mhm,
like, okay, no, it just turns out to be 3 books. But if
mhm,
I had wanted to expand on others, that's actually how the novellas came to be. Is
mhm,
I felt like some of the stories still needed to be told, and
mhm.
so I'm kind of continuing it, kind of not. But now I know how many there's going to be. But that's kind of how it was with me. Is just until you get to that point, it's just so hard to tell.
Yeah. You know what? I just like ultimately at the end of the day, I just want to tell a great story. I think ultimately that's what I care about. I think being able to, I think having a supportive community, right? Having right now, that's awesome, right? And knowing that some people are looking forward to it because they've been going through it with me, like that's a cool feeling. But and of course, it'd be cool to sell books, right? Of course, that
Oh yeah.
goes into the author journey. But I think ultimately, like the thing I care about is I just want to tell a really great story.
I
That's
think
what
most authors are like that.
you think. So you think that's like something a lot of authors have in common?
At least I think the best authors, the greatest authors are really like, I mean, not that like other people aren't, just the
Hmm.
way I've seen it, there are good authors and there are great authors,
Hmm.
and then there are the best authors. And the best are those who are born to write and born to tell stories and not care about how much money they make or how much fame they have.
Hmm.
And I think the great writers are those who really focus on this is my story and I'm going to tell it. Good
Hmm.
writers are the ones that write and expect to make money and like nothing
Hmm.
else.
And I
That's my
think that's hard.
personal opinion, though. I
And
know
I think
others
that
feel
I think
different.
there's also a challenge to that, right? Because at the same time, I want to I want to continue to be able to build around writing and have the author journey, right? And I think it would be disingenuous of me to say like, okay, of course I do want to sell copies and I do want as many people to read the book. But I think for me, it's like trying to understand that balance from the storytelling side of it. Is I just want to tell an incredible story. I think that's rereadable. I think I actually care about telling a story that a book that's rereadable because
Oh yeah.
I myself, having been a gamer my entire life, I
Yeah.
love puzzles and games. And there's something that I really love about going through a book and picking up on clues that help me figure out the ending and then realizing that I have to go back and reread it at some point
Hmm.
because there's things that I definitely missed. And
Oh
not
yeah.
missed because of not missed due to a lack of my own reading experience, missed because there's so many clues and hints and Easter eggs that could be picked up that go towards the world, the characters, or the plot. That when the readers are reading later on in the series, like, oh wow, he laid the groundwork for these things 3 books ago, 2 books ago, 4 books ago. And I think that that planning is very, very important to me, and helps to tell a greater, just an overarching story or series.
Yeah, that's honestly something that I noticed with One Piece. As it's continued, is
Mhm.
Oda. He has been dropping so many hints over the years. It's
Oh yeah.
insane. I'm completely caught up in the series. I'm even rewatching it, and I just finished the Skype arc after going through Wano. I noticed that he's been dropping hints since before Skypiea. And it's like, dude, you've been dropping this since then? It's just like unbelievable. And it's fun going back and reading through and rereading and rewatching and replaying because so many things you pick up that you
Mhm,
missed before or that you noticed but did not understand the significance.
mhm,
There was something that it wasn't even that big. It was a tattoo somebody had that literally looks like the world's serpent that we did not see until like 7
mhm.
chapters ago. And it's just like, I
And
was back in the freaking Jaya arc.
I think what's interesting is I think there's certain plot points or certain elements that the storytellers, that the writers have set in stone. They're like they know that is something that they can come back to.
Yeah.
Sometimes they've thought through and they're like, this is how this is going to be in a while. Other times they have loose ideas of it, but know that they can still come back to it as a tool
Yep.
in the overarching story. Yeah, and I know that's definitely a thing. I wanted to real quick. Yep. So, and real quick before we hop in Mary's question, I just want to touch, Lynn. I know you said what is the point of diminishing returns on series with purchase throughs. I want to make sure that I understood that. So what you are asking is that on long series, making less money with or making less money with longer series of books, diminishing returns on series with purchase throughs. Yeah, I was like, so I would say just clarify that for me because I want to make
Yeah.
sure I understand that. One thing that I do know, and this is more for fantasy, is that readers value long series.
Oh yeah.
Fantasy readers value long series over standalones because readers, at least for the fantasy genre, want to get pulled into these stories, which is why they're
Ah.
served more with longers. At what point do people lose interest in series and stop buying more? That's a great question.
I
Um,
will say with John M. Well, if I had known the sixth book was, it's not fantasy, but if I had known the sixth book was going to be so much boring description, I
mhm.
would not have bought it. I don't even, if I, whenever I reread that series, I don't even read the sixth one anymore because it's so much description.
And
It's insane.
I'll tell you what, Len. So like I think a really and this is interesting because I think your question is a little debatable because we've seen success stories where this has and hasn't worked. I think ultimately, if we make a promise to our reader in the first book, and that promise is this is the type of story that I'm going to be telling you, um, and the reader gets used to a type of story for 3 books, and then book 4 changes that type of story. If the reader is expecting a certain type of story and they're not engaged enough with the characters of the world, they're less likely to buy the future stories in the book if they're not engaged and connect enough with the characters. Um, but there's also been examples where great writers have told a type of story and then it changes. Like, of course, Wheel of Time is always such an influence of mine, where it changes throughout the course of the series, and it's very successful. It's done very, very successfully, and people love that because they're following the characters. Ask myself for a long, long like fantasy series, why did I keep reading even though the structure and the promise from the original book was changed? And for me, it's because I fell in love so much with the characters that I had to know what was the plot going to be. I had to know how the series was going to end. I think in series, the only times where I've stopped reading is when I felt like a book diverged too much from the A story of the series. I think if a book goes down a side quest for an entire book, out of a long fantasy series, I kind of lose interest because I'm like, interesting, but I want to know how they're going to kill the big bad enemy. I don't care about the side enemy because you've been building up to the big bad enemy for 4 books now. And I
Right.
would say, at least for me preferentially. So I mean, I think it really comes down to, once again, that promise of what is the original core story, or what is that original plot that you're trying to work out. Of course, it could be a little different for each of the genres, and obviously different reader expectations. But I think that's a really, really interesting conversation. I think it really is, and I definitely challenge myself as a writer with Scarecrow. I'm like, okay, how am I going to be adjusting that throughout the Scarecrow series? Does every book be an adventure throughout the book, or do I adjust elements of it? Who is the protagonist of the different books? Is it always Scarecrow is the protagonist? Does it follow different characters? Is it a cast of characters? I think those are questions that I think through, and balancing between what is the story that I am trying to tell, and then what is the reading experience based on whatever readership has grown with it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that was an absolutely great question. And then I wanted to touch on, let's see, finish. I wanted to tell, yeah, Mary, you had a really great question as well, because you asked, does anyone think about the theme before or discover it as it develops? I think it depends on what type of writer. This is what my gut tells me, is that each writer has a way of coming up with story, regardless of maybe they're a discovery, maybe they're an architect. I think writers have their own process. And I think certain writers have a process for, like, I'm going to start my story with an idea and a theme and a message, and then the story evolves from that. Other writers start writing, right, like our discovery, and the theme evolves over the course of the story. But I think that type of process is probably a more consistent thing from each project to project that they go, because that's how they like to explore storytelling as a writer.
Yeah. I know for myself, a lot of my themes, they just happen as I write.
Mm-hmm.
The only one that I actually planned was Burning Ember. I knew the theme was Kasai trying to find his father. It was kind of like a, not exactly like an identity thing, but
Mm-hmm.
trying to find his family. That
Mm-hmm.
was the only one that I have absolutely planned. The rest of my stories, fan fiction or not, I didn't know what it was going to be until I started writing. Then it's like, oh, it has this kind of theme.
Mm, yeah. I'm the exact opposite. I always start with the idea and the theme that I want to tell. I think with Scarecrow, I want to say that I forced myself into a free write. I think I was playing around with free writing, and I think by the time I was X amount of chapters into it, I think 5 or 6 chapters or 5 or 7 chapters, I was like, okay, this story has the potential to be in this type of world. I also like telling stories that do these types of things. There's these types of things I want in a story that I feel like I can do better than what I've seen or read previously. So then I ingrain themes and elements that I want to see into this framework, and then I layer that up to match my love and expectations for the story that I would love to tell.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I think I probably do that pretty. I think that's common for me specifically, as I tend to have my ideas tend to be front loaded on the front. My plot and thematic and messaging tends to be front loaded on the front end of my development process.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know sometimes that can really help. I've
Mm-hmm.
tried to think of a theme for like some of my stuff, but just it doesn't always stick. So
Mm-hmm. Right, and it just goes to show that every writer's different, and
oh
I
yeah,
think I think that's absolutely incredible. Um, some writers don't even think about what their theme is,
yeah.
and then they just let the
I've
book
seen that
evolve.
before.
Mhm.
I've seen that before where somebody is writing. And then like God, it was a fan fiction that I read. I don't think they knew what they were doing. Not like in a bad way exactly, but it seemed like their story was a little sporadic. It stayed within the storyline,
Mm-hmm.
but it seemed like for a few chapters it just jumped around too much.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly it just kind of snapped back. And it's like, I don't think they know what they're really trying to do here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a good story overall. I like it. It's one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorites, but still.
Yeah. It's hard to say. And then sometimes I think writers can get lost somewhere in along the lines of storytelling. They haven't really, if they embark on like a large series and they haven't really fully thought ahead about a lot of different elements, and then a book is published, and now they can only go back and change so much.
Right, right.
Mhm. So it's interesting. I think that's another reason that some writers will write a full series before they start publishing. That has been like a trend over the past couple of years.
I could see that. I haven't heard of that myself, but I could definitely understand that.
Yeah, I mean, you see with some authors where they will publish a book like once every couple months for a series because it builds up the readership and it builds up that expectation pretty quickly, and then you don't have
Yeah,
to wait
that
for
makes
the book.
sense.
You're like, oh, it's only in a couple months. That's a strategy. And then if you finish a series and then you start publishing, you're not shot in the foot because you can go back and change something, albeit more work if it takes more work, but it's not set in stone until it's published.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it's called. Rapid release. Yeah, Lynn called it. Rapid release is definitely a thing. Whether or not for series or for standalones. Obviously, easier to do as a standalone, right? Because then it's more about building up the readership over a short period of time as compared to building the readership through a standalone story, as compared to build a readership to my standalone style. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Sol, you have thank you for holding it down today.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. More than happy to do that, especially when you've got your busy schedule that you
You
need a
know, it's
break
funny.
from.
It's funny that you did world building because when I was doing my last year, I think when I was playing around with different styles of workshops on the different days, Wednesdays was my world building Wednesdays.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Way back when, and I was playing around with like every day was going to be like a different workshop. I mean, yeah, for anybody who's trying to do things consistently, it's just a lot of trial and error. I want to
Yep.
say I think I tried workshop styled streams for about 100 days before I made it a little bit more before I tried a different style.
That sounds about right. I kind of like vaguely remember some of that. So
Mm-hmm. And then I think like the iteration of the streams this year. And I think I think the current format of where the weekly streams are at, I think I kind of landed on around October, around the fall of last year. And that's kind of the general format I've been at for the weekly live streams, at least.
yeah, that sounds about right.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also because I have a book to write.
Yeah, no, that definitely
That's
helps.
part of it as well. I'm like, sure, yeah, I could plan workshops, but like, I am already so busy, and my time to write Scarecrow is so limited. Like, I got to finish writing this book.
Yeah, no kidding there.
Man, but so I appreciate you. For everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining us for this next episode meeting of the Right Now Writers Group. For those of you who are in the community and you don't know what's going on this week, tomorrow for YouTube channel members, I'm doing the open office hours. So if anybody needs feedback on their work and you are a YouTube channel member at that student tier, you should take advantage of it. Essentially, you're going to be able to show up and get one-on-one feedback with me for improvement on your storytelling or your journey as a writer. Depending on how many writers show up, you get more time. So definitely highly recommend that. That's going to be tomorrow directly after our live stream. And then, so that's the paid thing for YouTube channel members. And then for the free thing, this Sunday is the next episode of the Story and Critique show. I promise it will not be rescheduled. It will definitely not be rescheduled. I've never had to reschedule a stream so many times consistently back to back before. So this is the free one. If you haven't submitted before, like you totally should. I don't care if you've been in the community for a year or if you're just found us yesterday. The Story and Critique stream is a great, great resource. You're basically getting a free reading of an excerpt so you can hear it out loud, and you're getting free feedback from myself, who I've now read 200 story excerpts live through the critique stream. And I don't read any of these stories beforehand. I read them in the moment to keep myself entertained for the cold reading experience. So.
Oh yeah, and it's especially fun when suddenly he starts doing Old Man Kaufman.
And that speaks to my acting experience. I spent many years acting, and I think I didn't think that I would get to do things that involved more of my theater background. And I was like, all right. So I kind of get to play around with the voices a little bit, and I just have fun. Oh, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'll do audiobooks at some point if that's something that I can have the capability to.
I don't think you have the time, dude. You have a busy schedule.
I said at some point. We're not layering anything onto Kaufman's schedule this month. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, probably not even this month. I think for a while.
And I'm just going to start something else where I'm like, I got to finish Scarecrow.
Yeah. How about that? Finish that and then think about it.
So I'm thinking 10 years out, we'll be having this conversation in 10 years with Old Man Kaufman.
Yeah.
By the way, Big, thanks for the question. Kaufman, at what age did you start writing? I started writing when I was really young. I'm a very unique case in terms of writing, and I'll be very honest about that. I'm a very unique case. I started writing when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I wrote a 20-part book Mario series, and they weren't very long. They were like 10 pages with pictures. I read a lot of books when I was young. I was an avid reader. I sat in the back of the class throughout middle school and high school and wrote on my own fantasy stories for all the time. Most people didn't know what they were going to college for. I went to college to be a writer because I knew that's what I was passionate about. That it took me a while to figure out, to learn the craft, to do all the things and figure out how do I get to this part of my journey. It took me 20 years to figure it out, but I've always known that I wanted to be a writer. So thanks for the question, Big. I appreciate you. So when did you start writing? How old were you?
I know I officially started writing when I was about 11 or 12. But I've been immersed in stories probably since before I could talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember.
My mom used to tease me about I'd take her books and I'd be holding them upside down and trying to read them. And I was like 2, so but I had a very active imagination as a child. It could almost be embarrassing if I'd ever be embarrassed about that. And I would play all sorts of games on myself and create stories. So if I'm counting that, my entire life.
Like I was telling stories when I came out the womb.
Pretty much.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. That's all we got for you today. I'll be back tomorrow with another daily writing sprint stream. I believe it's a 3:00 Pacific one. Tomorrow is Thursday, so 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. I'll be here for some writing. Come join us. And that's what I got for you. Thanks all for joining us today. I'm Kaufman, and this is
Chat Soul.
And we'll catch you on the next stream. Stay creative, writers.
Right now.
Right now. Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Because it's time to write now.